Good evening, you're welcome. 261, the first of 3 days of hearings on the proposed abortion legislation got underway at the Oireachtas Health Committee today. There was disagreement over including the risk of suicide as a grounds for termination. The head of one of the main maternity hospitals told TDs and senators that it would create an ethical dilemma for his profession. Our correspondent David Davenport has been following the day's proceedings. He joins us now from Government Buildings. David.
Sharon, this was the first opportunity for committee members to quiz experts since the government produced the shape of its proposed legislation. There to hear from a range of opinion over 3 days. Today it was the turn of the medical profession with its particular focus on obstetrics. Committee Chair Jerry Buttimer called for a tolerant and dignified session. That didn't stop some government backbenchers, though, criticising the decision of James Riley to leave after his opening statement.
I can't think of a more appropriate or more important place that the Minister for Health might be this morning than in here in the chamber.
I just want to put on record my disappointment that the Minister is not here. I find it bizarre.
The Minister's spokesman said he'd felt it more appropriate for his Chief Medical Officer to field questions. Dr. Tony Holohan defended the role of psychiatrists in assessing suicidality.
I have to point out that it is a clinical science, psychiatry. It is a science, and it is based on scientific method and endeavour that psychiatrists. It is not a hocus pocus.
Some of the regulatory groups, including the Medical Council, wanted the bill changed to have a common assessment irrespective of whether the grounds for a termination were claimed to be mental or physical. And there were sharp differences on the suicide issue when the heads of the main maternity hospitals gave their views.
Our psychiatric colleagues tell us that there is currently no available evidence to show the termination of pregnancy as a treatment for suicidal ideation or intent. And as obstetricians, we are required to provide and practice evidence-based treatment. It therefore creates an ethical dilemma for any obstetrician who is requested to perform a termination of pregnancy for the treatment of someone who is with either suicidal ideation or intent.
One could be forgiven for thinking that this bill is about the risk of suicide in pregnancy. It's not. This bill is about saving women's life, regardless of whether that risk to life is physical or mental. But it is about saving her life.
Dr. Peter Boylan agreed with his colleagues, raising the suspicions of one TD.
I understand that both of you are related to marriage and that you're both...
The chairman tried in vain to rein Mr. McGrath in.
Given that both are leading voices amongst obstetricians in favour of the proposals, is there danger of groupthink here?
But the serious central issue today was the place of suicide in the legislation.
Suicide is death. Of course it is. Suicide is death. Yes, I agree with you. But I suppose I would invite you to agree with me that abortion is also death.
Again and again, the medical experts stressed the limited numbers involved.
Where terminations of pregnancy are performed to save a woman's life. These are rare. In my hospital, which is one of the busiest maternity hospitals in Europe, we perform approximately up to 5 of these procedures every year.
The hearing continues this evening.
So, David, lots of questions, lots of fraught exchanges, but did we learn anything new today?
Sharon, I think we learnt that the inclusion of suicide in the legislation is still a big problem. The Institute of Obstetrics and Gynecology said this morning there was no science to back it up. We heard Sam Coulter-Smith express similar sentiments there, although I think the masters of the main maternity hospitals today were broadly supportive of the government's legislation. I think that needs to be said. I think we also learnt that the medical profession has some technical changes it would like to see in the legislation. A broader range of hospitals where terminations might ultimately be carried out, perhaps a less restrictive system of assessing whether women are genuinely suicidal. But I think above all we did learn, Sharon, that there's still deep-seated opposition among some Fine Gael backbenchers to both the pace and the direction of this measure, and that's why government managers will want even more to avoid a damaging vote at the end of the day.
David Davenport, Government Buildings, thank you.
The Oireachtas Committee examining the heads of the Protection of Life in Pregnancy Bill has been told an unintended consequence of the legislation would see a rise in suicide rates among young men. A leading expert in the field, Professor Kevin Malone, warned the measure risks legitimising the concept of suicide by enshrining it in the law as a justification for seeking a termination.
Perinatal psychiatrists will be at the cutting edge of the government's proposed legislation. They're likely to be involved in deciding women are suicidal and in approving terminations. There are just 3 of them, all in Dublin and all present for today's hearing.
Suicide in pregnancy is real, a real risk. It does happen. Abortion is never a treatment for suicide, but nor is counselling or psychotherapy or antidepressants or anything else for that matter. There is no treatment for suicide.
Even though the incidence might be tiny, it was a symptom, he said, of a problem which society had swept under the carpet.
I've seen women now in their 80s who've talked about sticking knitting needles in themselves before abortion was available in England.
One of his colleagues said predicting which women were at risk would be impossible. That could lead to doctors erring on the side of caution and recommending terminations.
Being unable to predict who will die by suicide is therefore likely to lead to multiple what's termed false positives.
And it was young people, troubled and probably in care, who'd be seeking access to terminations.
The HSE, acting in loco parentis, may well seek the advice of a child and adolescent psychiatrist in making that decision. And this is probably the main group of pregnant teenage girls for whom the proposed legislation will, in effect, apply.
Those voices broadly supportive of the legislation, but this afternoon members of the psychiatric profession opposed to the measure.
If truly suicidal, with mental illness, the patient may not be able to give a valid consent.
Abortion has no place in modern medicine. It's a medieval solution to crisis pregnancy.
And one suicide expert who said he was on neither side of the abortion argument. Professor John Malone warned the bill might increase already high suicide rates among young men by being seen to legitimise the threat of taking your own life.
I'm wondering how mental health literacy will be taught in schools, explaining that suicidality is legitimised for women in certain circumstances, where the rate is 2 per million for pregnant females, but not for young men, where the rate is 350 per million, or 150-fold, if you like.
The hearing is continuing this evening.
Let's talk to David Davenport, who joins us now. David, particularly for those TDs and senators who have continuing concerns about this this draft bill, were those concerns, do you think, to any extent allayed by what they heard today?
I don't believe they were, Brian. One of the threads running through today's hearing and last Friday has been the almost total absence of any empirical data to link suicidal ideation, suicide and abortion and termination of pregnancy. One thing we did learn was that the numbers are absolutely tiny, and that led one committee member, Senator Fidel Mahealy-Eames, to ask how many unborn children had to be sacrificed in questionable circumstances to protect what could be as few as 1 in 500,000 pregnancies in genuine trouble due to the risk or danger of suicide of the mother. And of course then we saw suicide in another guise raised somewhat surprisingly by Professor Kevin Malone, who, as it happens, has today published a major suicide study. He raised the issue of the concept being in some way legitimised in the legislation. He said that could lead to an increase in the already sky-high rates of suicide among young men around the country. So a lot of food for thought, and troubling food for thought at that, for TDs and senators today.
All right, David, on another matter, this spat between Mick Wallace and Minister for Justice Alan Shatter. Is the Minister under... A senior Fianna Fail TD has called for the party leadership to allow a free vote in the Dáil and Seanad on abortion. Finance spokesman Michael McGrath's intervention comes on the final day of the Health Committee hearings examining the government's proposed legislation. The Protection of Life During Pregnancy bill will come before the Dáil later in the summer.
Protest outside Leinster House as the main parties continue to grapple with the abortion issue. Problems for Fianna Fail all too obvious, as a senior figure conceded they'd struggle to find an agreed position.
I think it would be very difficult on a lot of members if the whip was imposed on them to force through a certain decision. This is a particularly sensitive, divisive issue. People have very strong personal views, and I think for our party that should be recognised.
Giving evidence at the Health Committee itself today, legal experts. One said we should be under no illusions about what the government's measure entailed.
Under Head 4, it will be statutorily provided for that the aim of the procedure can be to bring about the death of the unborn child. that will be the desired aim of the procedure, not some other form of treatment, not some form of relocation, not some form of therapy to the mother which has that consequence, but that is the actual goal of the procedure. That is a new departure.
Another expert insisted that even though there was little research in the area, the legislation was needed.
The presumption that because this tiny group hasn't been studied, no conclusions should be made about them and they should be excluded from the protection of the Constitution of this country, because that is the logical conclusion of what is proposed, is, I think, a stunning assertion.
And fundamental disagreement later between constitutional lawyers about the need to legislate at all.
Emphatically no. And if one listens very, very closely to the government, they will actually concede that point.
The fact that X is the law of the land, and I feel that the government is constitutionally constrained to bring forward this legislation.
These committee hearings are winding up now, and attention will soon turn to how the legislation fares in the Dáil and Seanad. But with Micheál Martin facing calls for a free vote, it's clear that Fianna Fail could be in serious trouble in both houses. David Davenport, RTE News, Leinster House.
Fianna Fail TDs and senators will have a free vote on the government's abortion legislation. The decision came after a parliamentary party meeting couldn't reach consensus on the measure. Party leader Micheál Martin favours backing the government, but the party is deeply divided on the issue. For more on this, David Davenport joins us now from government buildings. This wasn't the outcome Micheál Martin wanted, David.
No, it wasn't, Sharon, but it became inevitable after a marathon parliamentary party meeting earlier this month laid bare the divisions within Fianna Fail on this issue. As you said, Micheál Martin and some of his senior colleagues wanted to back the government's measure, but they encountered significant opposition from within the parliamentary party, particularly, it must be said, from a number of senators. It was clear that Micheál Martin might have been able to carry the day at the parliamentary party, but that the issue of conscience involved was one that would see him certainly losing some of his TDs and senators when it came to votes, and with the parliamentary party of 19 he could ill afford to lose anybody. He was taken aback then when last week his constituency colleague and finance spokesman Michael McGrath backed earlier calls for a free vote. So it's come to this. He's, if you like, bowed to the inevitable. He had little enough room for manoeuvre, but this afternoon Micheál Martin denied that it represented a damaging development for his leadership.
Well, first of all, I've been discussing this with TDs and senators for quite some time now over the last number of months. Obviously, we initially sought to achieve a consensus, but this is a unique issue. People have genuinely, deeply held views and beliefs on the issue itself, and I certainly didn't want to force my particular view down anybody's throat and to sort of force them into a position where they would fundamentally be going against their own beliefs. And I think there was a genuine consensus. This issue has been floating for quite some time within the party as to how we approach it. Times are changing in politics, and I think it does facilitate the articulation of a person's particular view on this bill.
So what can we expect then, David, when the full legislation goes through the Dáil? Lots of disquiet, clearly, but will we see a vote called for?
Well, the first thing that this development ensures is that it certainly dispels any lingering hopes that the government might have had that there wouldn't be a vote on this issue. There'll certainly now be the requisite 10 TDs in a position to call for one. It will also, I suppose, increase the pressure on TDs and senators in all parties, with activists on each side of the debate presumably calling them to follow Fianna Fáil's lead. Enda Kenny and Eamon Gilmore will easily resist that pressure. It'll certainly increase pressure on individual Fianna Fáil TDs and senators who won't be able to shelter behind the party whip now, and I suppose it'll be cited as a precedent for the future if there are any other issues that could be described as issues of confidence for Micheál Martin and his party.
David Davenport, Government Buildings, thank you.